Okay, so this week we're going to start the last section of the Rav Soloveitchik course. We're going to do a section on Tefillah, two classes. It was originally going to be one, but next week we're going to do a section a rather lengthy section from Lonely Man of Faith, which when I was preparing for the Lonely Man of Faith classes, I decided would really make a better end to the Tefillah section. And honestly, it's going to, I think, make a really excellent end for the whole course. So, Rav Soloveitchik's written a lot on Tefillah, and we're not going to touch on all of it. Next week is focusing just on Only Man of Faith. This week we're going to see pieces from a couple of different texts. We're going to look at some important passages from his book on Tefillah, Worship of the Heart. We're going to talk about one of his essays, Redemption Prayer and Talmud Torah. I'm going to do a piece from an essay called The Community, another piece from Called to Do the Fake. We're going to jump around a little bit, but part of the reason we do that is that what we're going to focus on is the connection between Tefillah and Geulah, prayer and redemption. Then also more importantly, the connections between prayer as specifically about asking for things, about petition, it's called, and suffering. And then the way that leads into the community of prayer, the way we pray as a community, but more importantly, the way prayer and the connection between what it means to be human and to pray and suffering are all tied together and help make us into a community. So that's going to be today's class. Before that, I want to note that our whole year has been structured based on the tension between majesty and humility in Rav Soloveitchik's writing. So we looked at how the various texts emphasize one or the other or both, or what they do, how they manage that dialectic, to use his term, of back and forth. And this week we're going to be focusing on suffering, which is on the humility end, that recognizing our sort of humble role. We'll see this section here I've called on the source sheet sacrifice, because nothing is ever just one thing. We'll talk a little more about the duality within Tefillah as well. But on the whole, this is going to focus on the ability to sort of see yourself as weak or humble, or to take a posture of surrender, an openness to the other, something like that. So I'm going to jump in with one of the introductory paragraphs from Worship of the Heart, which is going to set up for how Rav Soloveitchik explores Tefillah more generally. Source number 1, he says, "Therefore, when I speak about the philosophy of prayer, or Shema, I do not claim universal validity for my conclusions. I'm not lecturing on philosophy of prayer as such, but on prayer as understood, experienced, and enjoyed by an individual. I acquaint you with my own personal experience. Whether taking into consideration the differences between minds and the peculiarities of the individual, my experience can be detached from my idiosyncrasies and transferred to others, I do not know." So Rav Soloveitchik opens his big book discussing Tefillah, which goes into very technical sort of details of both Tefillah and of philosophy. He opens it by saying, all of that is very subjective. It's just how I feel about Tefillah, and it's what Tefillah makes me feel. And on the one hand, this is how Rav Soloveitchik starts some of the other writings as well. The Lonely Man of Faith starts with a very similar sort of declaration that it all comes from a very personal place. But the flip side also, I think, has a lot to do with Tefillah. That Tefillah has to come from that very personal place. And because of that, Tefillah, no one else can really tell you about Tefillah in a objectively correct sense. They can tell you what Tefillah feels like to them, and you see if that's what it feels like to you as well. Since that'll be what happens with this class. I'm going to talk a lot about how Rav Soloveitchik sees Tefillah. You have to dive in and see if it makes sense to you, if that's what it feels like to you. And if not, you can ask why not and see exploring it. Obviously, one of the unique things about being Jewish is a very fixed and intense tefillah system, so that not every religion has that, and it means one of the things it means is that Jews will share experiences of tefillah to a great degree. Our experience of davening was very similar to Rav Soloveitchik, simply because we share the same text guiding our tefillot, guiding our experience of prayer. But the very subjective aspect of it, is something that no one else can really determine for you. You have to determine that for yourself. Okay, so with that, I want to jump into the body of this. I'm first going to talk about the redemption of prayer. We'll begin almost by defining redemption in a way that is true really throughout Rav Soloveitchik's works, but for our purposes, it's very important for understanding the role of tefillah within Judaism. Source number 2 from Redemption Prayer in Talmud Torah. What is redemption? Redemption involves a movement by an individual or a community from the periphery of history to its center, or to employ a term from physics, redemption is a centripetal movement. To be on the periphery means to be a non-history-making entity, while movement towards the center renders the same entity history-making and history-conscious. Naturally, the question arises, what is meant by a history-making people or community? A history-making people is one that leads to a speaking, storytelling, communing-free existence, while a non-history-making, non-history-involved group leads a non-communing and therefore a silent, unfree existence. So, he's clearly talking here in terms of the redemption of the nation on a historic level, and in the original essay, a lot of it focusing on Yetziat Mitzrayim specifically. But he's talking about what it means for them to be redeemed is to go from being peripheral and unimportant to being of central importance. Like redemption, prayer too is a basic experiential category in Judaism. We have appeared within the historical arena as a prayerful nation. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon all prayed. Through prayer, they achieved the covenant with God, and through prayer, we expect eventually to realize that covenant. Right, so tefillah is started by saying that redemption is important, and this is also somewhat central. And he says tefillah is also central to us and helps define who we are. And in saying that, we'll see this explicitly in the next source. He is, in a sense, talking about the redemption of tefillah itself. That tefillah is central, the same way that redemption renders the Jewish people central within history. Redemption of prayer renders prayer central within Judaism. So source number 3. This is from a section of Worship of the Heart where he deals a lot with Rambam's understanding of tefillah. Rambam is opposed to the Ramban. Maimonides is opposed to Nachmanides. Said that tefillah is a mitzvah d'oraita, it's a biblical commandment, as opposed to the Ramban, who said that it's simply a rabbinic commandment, released on the level everyday, regular tefillah. So the Rav Soloveitchik explored at length what it is about tefillah that Rambam is so insistent that it must be a biblical commandment. So source number 3 is, according to Rambam, it is impossible to conceive of divine worship without including prayer in it. And the worship here is avodash b'lev, worship of the heart. What then is prayer? It is the expression of the soul that yearns for God via the medium of the word, through which the human being gives expression to the storminess of his soul and spirit. Right, it's impossible to imagine worshiping God without the human ability to express your inner life through words. The Torah commands love and fear of God, total commitment to Him and cleaving unto Him. Antithetical, dynamic experiences which seek to erupt and reveal themselves must be integrated into the external concrete realm through the forms of language and expression by means of song, weeping, and supplication. Had the Torah not commanded prayer as the exclusive medium for expressing inward worship, we do not know what the God-seeking human being whose soul thirsts for the living God would do. Could one entertain the thought that Judaism would want man to suppress his experience? On the contrary, Halacha was always interested in the expression of the inner life, in the uncovering of the subjective and opaque, and in the conversion of emotion and thought into action. How could one assume that halacha was totally oblivious to the supreme attainment that is to prayer? Did halacha demand that worship be mute, that experiences be concealed, that they not be allowed to expression? There's a couple of ideas bound up in this paragraph. The first is that people naturally want to pray. We have this sort of inner life that worships God. And what would we do if we didn't have a biblical commandment, right? What part of what is at issue is the historical distance from the giving of the Torah to the creation of, rabbinic models of tefillah, rabbinic texts of tefillah. What happened in all of that time? If you say tefillah is just a rabban, it's only a rabbinic mitzvah, what do people do in all that time? For Rav Soloveitchik, there has to have been a biblical mitzvah, because only thus were we sort of permitted to express our inner yearnings. And the second issue is that it's actually fundamental to halacha, so not just fundamental to people so that we want to dive in and need halacha to sort of permit it or enable it. But halacha is fundamentally for Rav Soloveitchik about taking something internal and giving it external form. That external form is something that has concrete presence in the real world, and that's important. And it's also something that is public and shared with a community. It's not simply private and individual and entirely subjective. And so for both of those reasons, we just had to have tefillah from the very beginning of giving the Torah, from the very beginning of halacha. When Rambam said that prayer is biblically ordained and identical with the service of the heart, he thereby redeemed love, fear, and indeed our entire religious life from muteness. Right? When Rambam said that tefillah is deoraita, then all of those things involved in tefillah, the love and the fear and inner religious life, all went from being sort of silent and rejected to being absolutely central. That's why redemption of tefillah. They were given a voice. The lover expresses his yearning, the trembler his fear, the wretched and dejected his helplessness, the perplexed his confusion, and the joyful his religious song, all within the framework of prayer. And I think it's worth taking a second to dwell on this question of the centrality of prayer and the idea that tefillah itself might need to be redeemed. Because a variety of places throughout Rav Soloveitchik's writings, even in Worship of the Heart, you might get the idea that somehow prayer is not that important, that maybe like Talmud Torah is important. Maybe, he talks about many times the importance of doing chesed and caring for the other and all kinds of different things that are important. Self-creation and sort of shaping yourself consciously, very important. We're going to talk next week about his consistent interest in some sort of attempting to be a prophet is important, but he does not emphasize tefillah in the same way throughout the rest of his writings. So I think it's very important to note he really does see it as central, and he sees the fact of its centrality as really important, right? It's not just that it happens to be an important part of Judaism. No, it actually just everything that Judaism is about halacha, about man's inner life, it all points to the importance of tefillah, and so we have to note and repeat. He talks multiple times that worship of the heart. This idea of the redemption of tefillah. That tefillah was long considered to have been something sort of sidelined, but we must really understand how central it is for Judaism, the ability to express ourselves to God, to take our inner life and make it into some sort of communicable ideas and words, is absolutely central to Judaism. The question that immediately follows from that would be, what does that look like? What form does it take? What are we expressing? And also it goes into that at length in Worship of the Heart. I really recommend the whole book. Most of the book is a lengthy discussion of aesthetics that is good and interesting, but I think in many ways very different from modern sensibilities about aesthetics, though I think without too much difficulty could be translated into some more modern, contemporary, and more to us intuitive terminology. What I want to focus on, though, is the idea of petition. That tefillah, Chazal already divided tefillah up into praise, petition, and gratitude, and thanksgiving. That the Shemona Esrei can be divided into the brachot that are really praising God, the brachot that are saying thanks to God, and in the middle of the brachot that are asking God for things. And we're going to see that for Rav Soloveitchik, that's really pretty central. Rabbi Dr. Shai Held has actually explored very well in his book on Avram Yeshua Heschel. He's explored some of the differences between Heschel and Rav Soloveitchik on a variety of topics, and one of them he does very well is the question of what is central in Tefillah. And for Rav Soloveitchik, it's petition, as we're going to see. It's asking for things, versus for Heschel, it's praise, and the praise in the moment where we get outside ourselves. And just in general, people look up a lot for answers like, what is Tefillah, what's it about? And in many ways, that comes from a sort of difficulty with asking for things from God, that it feels strange for us to ask for things from God for one of 100 different reasons, not the least of which is the fundamental question, like, well, if God knows, then why do I have to ask? And if God always does what's best, then what does it matter if I ask or not? I think there's a variety of answers to those questions, depending on what sort of tact you take within philosophy. But I think Rav Soloveitchik's answer is, I think, very deeply compelling, in large part because it doesn't require denying that we're asking for things. In many ways, many responses to these questions say, well, Tefillah is not really asking for things. But the problem with that is that when you read the text of the Siddur, or Shemona Esrei at least, it really feels like we're asking for things. Contrast like Shema. Shema is very clearly we're not asking for anything. Shema is something very different from the Shemona Esrei. But the Shemona Esrei and the Amidah really does feel like we're asking for things. So one of the advantages of Rav Soloveitchik's approach, as opposed to many others I've struggled with, is that you don't have to deny that. You can say, okay, I'm asking for things, and then he goes and shows why that is still very meaningful and sort of doesn't run into those other problems we raised before. We're not going to get into all of that because we go through it. I just want to explain what he's getting at with each piece, but the answers are there. Okay, so source number 4, still from Worship of the Heart. The reason for the centrality that Judaism has given to the element of petition in the service lies in our philosophy of prayer. Avodah Shebelei, worship of the heart, for all its tendency to express the religious experience as a whole, and particularly the emotional aspect, does also tend to single out a particular state of mind. For when we view the noetic content of prayer, noetic meaning just cognitive intellectual knowledge, like what is the content of it, the words, we must admit that one emotion is central as far as prayer is concerned, namely the feeling of unqualified dependence. David expressed this experience of complete, absolute, unconditional dependence upon God in his beautiful verse, "If I did not quiet myself like a weaned child upon his mother, verily my soul is like one weaned. But Israel hope in God now and forever." Right, so as I started by saying that this aspect of Tefillah we're looking at is part of the humility pole of Rav Soloveitchik's thought. This is really what I had in mind, that the key and most central emotion of Tefillah, and not the only one, but the most central one, is unqualified dependence, that we are totally and absolutely dependent on God. So number 5, we're going to get into sort of why that is. Human existence exhausts itself in the experience of crisis, in the continual discovering of oneself in distress, in the steady awareness of coming closer and closer to the brink of utter despair, the paradoxical concept of being born out of nothingness and running down to nothingness. This is a part of the ontic consciousness of man. The factum expressed in the 2 words "I am" is an incomplete sentence. You must always qualify it by adding 2 words, "I am in distress." Judaism wants man to discover the tragic element of his existence, to place himself voluntarily in distressing narrowness, to explicate and bring to the fore the deep-seated crisis in his very existence. Surely, man must fight courageously against the extraneous surface crisis. Judaism has charged man with the task of improving creation, confronting evil and destructive forces, and protecting himself against disease and natural catastrophes, approaching the world with an optimistic philosophy of activism. Right, so there's two things in this paragraph. That first, it is in fact human nature to be in crisis. That the reason that the key emotion of tefillah is absolute dependence on God and being sort of insufficient to ourselves, because that is the nature of being human, is to always be in trouble, I guess, in distress, is his words. However, because it's the sort of depth crisis, not something superficial, that the superficial crises of man are things we can deal with. It says that the last line here, Judaism has charged man with the task of improving creation, confronting evil and destructive forces, of protecting himself against disease, natural catastrophes, approaching the world with an optimistic philosophy of activism. To refer back to our Lonely Man of Faith shiur, that's Adam 1. That's the technologist who can conquer the world and make it work for us. The depth crisis, the tragic element of life, is Adam 2, someone who recognizes their own aloneness, the way in which they can't ever really make themselves understood to other people. And part of that is the fact they also can't have maybe parts of themselves that are not totally open to their own intellect, what he calls the aboriginal element of faith. And then also the fact that they are really dependent on others, God and other people, for redemption. Out of the depths in which the individual finds himself, one calls upon God in seclusion and loneliness. The existential, passional experience is not shared by the thou, however close he is to the I, since it is an integral part of the existential awareness, which is singular, and hence inexpressible in the universal terms through which we communicate our standardized experiences. No one but the sufferer himself is involved in this deeply human anguish and conflict. It is the sufferer whose awareness oscillates between bliss and pain, and the great negation of the finite that arises out of its confrontation by the infinite. Neither spouse, nor child, nor parent may understand and sympathize with the lonely individual when his existential experience is at a low ebb, when trials, doubts, and inhibitions abound. The prayer, echoing the depth crisis of a questing soul, emerges from seclusion, from out of the loneliness of the individual from whom everybody save God has abandoned. Our inability to ever be truly connected with other people leads us to the sense of deep anguish and the oscillating between bliss and pain, when we recognize that we are finite, but also have the possibility of confronting the infinite. Those are the root emotions that emerge into our tefillah. Our tefillah is meant to give form to them. Verse number 6, when man is in need and prays, God listens. One of God's attributes is shomea tefillah, he who listens to prayer. Let us note that Judaism has never promised that God accepts all prayer. And here he's confronting the question of what does it mean to pray to God. The efficacy of prayer is not the central term of inquiry in our philosophy of Avodah Belev. He's not ultimately concerned with does prayer work. Acceptance of prayer is a hope, a vision, a wish, a petition, but not a principle or a premise. The foundation of prayer is not the conviction of its effectiveness, but the belief that through it we approach God intimately and the miraculous community embracing finite man and his Creator is born. The basic function of prayer is not its practical consequences, but the metaphysical formation of a fellowship consisting of God and man. Right? The question is not, does tefillah work, or is it answered? Because that's not the goal of tefillah. That's the means of tefillah. Right? Asking for things is the tool through which tefillah accomplishes its goal. But the goal is to create the relationship between man and God. We call it a fellowship, or the miraculous community of God and man. That when you turn to God from the deepest part of who you are and reach out to God, that creates a relationship. I say the deepest part of who you are because, as I said before, he's going to continue to say now, that sense of lack and suffering and need and dependency is the perhaps most human thing about us. Man is always in need because he is always in crisis and distress. Inner distress expresses itself in man's disapproval of himself. This awareness is of a metaphysical origin, although it may be manifested at an individual, psychological, social, institutional, or political level. Man is dissatisfied with himself, and he lacks faith in the justifiability and legitimacy of his existence. Somehow, every human being, great or small, however successful and outstanding, loses every day afresh his ontic fulcrum, the equilibrium of his being, which he tries steadily to recover. He feels the paradox involved in an existence which has been imposed upon him in an unexplained way, and which finally betrays and deserts him in the same absurd manner. Quotes from Pirkei Avot: "Against your will were you born, against your will do you live, and against your will do you die." Even the simplest man may perceive and comprehend this existential tragic aspect of man. So just working backwards through this paragraph, there's a sort of very existential, technical reference, Heideggerian understanding of man, which is that we come into the world against our will and we leave the world against our will. What Heidegger calls thrownness, that we are. It's as if we're thrown into the world like an object. We're just, once we arrive, we don't sort of land solidly. We're just continuously traveling towards death. And there's a sense of powerlessness involved in that drives everything else. It drives our inability to connect to other people because we're too aware of our own death, and we feel in some ways trapped within ourselves, and incapable of expressing to other people the truly subjective experience of fear for our own futures, because it's such a selfless thing that you can't ever convey that personal aspect of it. And that is what we bring with us into Tefillah, is that sense of aloneness of, there are things about me that I can't communicate to other people, even though I know they're experiencing their own version of the same thing. And that is what sort of drive our Tefillah. Now for the last source in the section, I want to look at another piece from Redemption Prayer and Talmud Torah, where he's going to hit on some of the same language we've seen so far, but I think also there's some important new ideas here. Judaism, in contradistinction to mystical quietism, which will recommend a toleration of pain, wants man to cry out aloud against any kind of pain, to react indignantly to all kinds of injustice or unfairness. For Judaism held the individual who displays indifference to pain and suffering, and who meekly reconciles himself to the ugly, disproportionate, and unjust in life, is not capable of appreciating beauty and goodness. Whoever permits his legitimate needs to go unsatisfied will never be sympathetic to the crying needs of others. A human morality based on love and friendship, on sharing in the travail of others, cannot be practiced if the person's own need awareness is dull. He does not know what suffering is. Hence, Judaism rejected models of existence which deny human needs, such as the angelic or the monastic. For Judaism, need awareness constitutes part of the definition of human existence. Need awareness turns into a passional experience, into a suffering awareness. Dolorem fere ergo sum, I suffer, therefore I am. To paraphrase Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. While the Cartesian cogito would also apply to an angel or even to the devil, our inference is limited to man. Neither angel nor devil knows suffering. Something really beautiful in the sort of play on terms, or drasha, almost even just the end, the homiletic move of saying, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And what defines us as people is thinking. And for Rav Soloveitchik, it certainly echoes Rambam, who said that Tzelem Elokim is our intellect. What makes us human, in the most important sense, is actually our suffering and our awareness of our own needs, awareness of lack. That is so central to who we are. And here he's also added in a very important aspect that we'll touch on next week, which is the centrality of the ethical in Judaism and in Tefillah specifically. that part of what's important about recognizing our own needs and being aware of our own needs, being aware of the fact that we need, of how we are needy on an inherent level, is that this will drive us to ethical action, that we can identify with the fact that other people need things and we should help fill their needs because we ourselves need things. It's just generally a very important aspect of thinking about society, is thinking about the fact that everyone needs things. And this is clear as the beginning and ends of our lives, because nobody comes into the world or leaves the world um, alone. Despite what we said in this last source, we really experience it as happening alone. It's somehow unique and individual. However, on a practical level, nobody can take care of themselves after they're born. There are many, many years after you're born. And usually also there's a few years before you die, where you cannot take care of yourself, when you need others. You're so fully dependent on others. But as we sort of discussed a little bit throughout, that is just the extreme cases at the beginning of our lives. We're always dependent on other people for some things. And we need to be aware of that, and aware that that's not weakness. It's not like people choosing to need other people, or people sort of failing or not working hard enough, or anything that generates their needs. People will always have needs, and so as a community, we should be responding to them at an ethical level to help other people fill their needs, as well as davening both for our own needs and for the needs of others. Therefore, prayer in Judaism, unlike the prayer of classical mysticism, is bound up with human needs, wants, drives, and urges, which make man suffer. Prayer is the doctrine of human needs. Prayer tells the individual, as well as the community, what his or its genuine needs are, what he should or should not petition God about. Of the 19 benedictions in our Amidah, 13 are concerned with basic human needs, individual as well as social and national. Even 2 of the last 3 benedictions, Ritzay and Sim Shalom, are of a petitional nature. The person in need is summoned to pray. To a happy man, to a contented man, the secret of prayer was not revealed. God neither needs nor thanks nor hymns. He wants to hear the outcry of man confronted with a ruthless reality. He expects prayer to rise from a suffering world cognizant of its genuine needs. In short, through prayer, man finds himself. Prayer enlightens man about his needs. It tells man the story of his hidden hopes and expectations. It teaches him how to behold the vision and how to strive in order to realize this vision, when to be satiated with what one possesses, when to reach out for more. In a word, man finds his need awareness himself in prayer. Of course, the very instant he finds himself, he becomes a redeemed being. And so here, Rav Soloveitchik has responded to some more questions about Tefillah, like why we're davening, or why we're asking for things if that's not the goal. In addition to the fact that it's when we bring ourselves to Tefillah most fully, which he says at the end, that's how we find ourselves. He adds that the specific brachot and the specific requests we make, help us determine what are good things to want, what are truer needs, what are basic human needs, individual as well as social and national. So you go throughout Shemona Esrei, and there's requests for individual healing, but also requests for sort of societal healing involved in having good leaders and political sovereignty, and more religious requests like Ritzay, let our tefillot be received, and let us bring korbanot. All those different kinds of requests. And when we request them, we learn not just the words, but also we train ourselves to ask for these things. So these are the things we should be asking for because we should, in fact, need them, and we do need them. And Tefillah helps us recall that we need them. Just in general, that's a theme he explores more at length in Redemption Prayer and Talmud Torah for anyone who wants to go look it up, is the idea that we, particularly in the modern world, just in general, aren't always aware of what our proper needs are. Not that sort of inherently unclear, and we have to be taught by someone, but just that we have come to a place in our life, and we often come to places where we've become distant from ourselves, from our own sort of the truth of our own existence, and we're not paying enough attention, and Tefillah helps us relearn what we need to know about our own basic sort of needs and become aware of our needs. So I'm going to do a quick passage from the end of Redemption Prayer and Talmud Torah, so that even here, Rav Soloveitchik sees there being multiple parts of Tefillah, that it has both majesty and humility aspects. He says, source number 8, what does this term denote? Avodash b'lev, not the service of the heart, but the not Avodash b'lev. I don't know where the Hebrew term is here. Not the service of the heart, but the offering of the heart. Judaic dialectic plays mischievously with two opposites, two irreconcilable aspects of prayer. It announces prayer as self-acquisition, self-discovery, self-objectification, and self-redemption. By sensitizing and logicizing the awareness of need, man delivers himself from the silence and from non-being. It becomes an I, a complete being who belongs to himself. At this level, prayer makes man feel whole. At this level, prayer means self-acquisition. Yet there is another aspect to prayer. Prayer is an act of giving away. Right? So we're not just becoming totally aware of who we are and sort of gaining a strong sense of self. You're also somehow giving ourselves away. Prayer means sacrifice, unrestricted offering of the whole self, the returning to God of body and soul, everything one possesses and cherishes. There is an altar in heaven upon which the archangel Michael offers the redemption. Upon which the archangel Michael offers the souls of the righteous. Thrice daily we petition God to accept our prayers, as well as the fires, the self-sacrifices of Israel on that altar. Prayer is rooted in the idea that man belongs not to himself, but that God claims man, and that his claim to man is not partial, but total. Of course, Judaism is vehemently opposed to human sacrifice. The Bible speaks with indignation and disdain of child sacrifice. Physical human sacrifice was declared abominable. Yet the idea that man belongs to God without qualification, and that God from time to time makes demands upon God to return what is God's to God, is an important principle in Judaism. Right, so what we've talked about so far is that Tefillah is about recognizing our human needs. And on one level, that's a matter of like seeing our own frailty and recognizing dependence on God, but it does actually create a strong sense of self. It's a self with a certain sort of posture towards God and the world, and God and towards other people. And so sometimes, however, we are in fact supposed to sacrifice that sense of self, that sort of move further out of our own perspective, move ourselves more to the margins of our own perspective, by recognizing that what is important for us to do is, to obey God. One of Rav Soloveitchik's students, his son-in-law, Rav Soloveitchik, is a phenomenal essay called Ma Enosh, Reflections on Judaism and Humanism, if I recall correctly. It was a phenomenal article, and one of the things it talks about is the idea of that humanism is about appreciating humanity and humans, but also about humans functionally being the standard of value, that what determines, what's good at things to do, what's the best way to live life, is just human concerns. He says by that standard, Judaism can never be fully humanistic, because Judaism ultimately believes that man is not the measure of all things, that there is another standard of evaluation, which is God's will, that will sometimes, perhaps even often, but certainly sometimes, override our own concerns. That's what it means here for, sometimes sacrifice, sort of metaphorical human sacrifice, is demanded. That sometimes we have to put aside our own concerns and open ourselves up to God's concerns. Thus, a new equation emerges: prayer equals sacrifice. Initially, prayer helps man discover himself through understanding and affirmation of his need awareness. Once the task of self-discovery is fulfilled, man is summoned to ascend the altar and return everything he has just acquired to God. Man who is told to create himself, objectify himself, and gain independence from and freedom for himself must return everything he considers his own to God. right? So Tefillah becomes this dialectic back and forth motion that helps us gain a strong sense of who we are, and then it demands of us and asks of us. It helps us give up that sense of self and return everything to God. So thus far, we've seen that Tefillah is about recognizing our needs and that we are inherently needy. And that's why we ask for things, because we have to ask for them. They do not come to us of their own, nor are they things we can easily achieve. And because speaking about the form of asking is a way of expressing who we are, and speaking as who we are both as individuals and as humans and as members of the Jewish people, it's just that level of need permeates the deepest aspects of ourselves. That is the way we can be sort of most real and most present in Tefillah, in a relationship with God, and it creates that miraculous community, that fellowship you mentioned earlier with God. And in doing so, Tefillah, the individual brachot, allow us to examine our sense of needs and see what we feel like we need, feel like we don't need. It becomes a reflective process. And then at some point, we realize that we may actually even need to give up on our own concerns, what we think we need, what we think we don't need. And that is the overall picture of tefillah here, that it's a way of expressing our natural inner life as needy beings, as dependent beings, as individuals, and as members of larger collectives. And then I want to pivot here towards the question of suffering, prayer, and community. Source number 9 from an article helpfully titled "The Community." When the I becomes aware of his being responsible for the well-being of the thou, right? When one person realizes they're responsible for someone else, whom he has helped bring into existence, a new community emerges, the community of prayer. You're sort of responsible for them. Then you realize that the mutual responsibility for well-being leads to prayer. What does this mean? It means a community of common pain, of common suffering, right? Community of prayer means a community of common suffering. The halacha has taught the individual to include his fellow man in prayer. The individual must not limit himself to his own needs, no matter how pressing those needs are and how distinguished he is. Halacha has formulated prayer in the plural. There is hardly a prayer which avails itself of the grammatical singular. Even private prayers, such as those offered on the occasions of sickness, death, or other crises, are recited in the plural. This is essentially what is happening in source number 10. The source number 10 focuses on Eov, and how the story of Eov is about recognizing this, recognizing that what it means to partake with other people and what it means to daven is to be aware that we are connected to other people and that we are responsible for other people. That we all share our same suffering, and we all daven the same way, because if davening is about asking for relief from our crises, from our suffering, from our needs and our lacks, then that's true of all of us together. That is, in a sense, the most unified and on the same page we can all be is when we're all saying, "Please, God, help us fulfill our goals. Help us be strong in the places where we are weak. Help us attain things we could not attain otherwise. Help us just be healthy." That, in some ways, one of the hardest things, just be healthy. For our bodies are not in our control. And that is perhaps the most unifying aspect of who we are. So with that, we'll end for this week. Next week, we're going to go back to Lowly Man of Faith and specifically talk about this idea of the community of prayer, which Rav Soloveitchik will contrast with the community of prophecy. And we'll see what is the relationship between those things on several different areas and how they're connected. Much better them.